The last day of Auschwitz. On the afternoon of January 27, 1945, Sal de Lanema, a 30-year-old Dutch Jew, 5 months resident in Auschwitz, ventured into the snow outside his barracks door for the first time since the Germans had evacuated the camp 9 days earlier. He had climbed into his bunk on January 18th, expecting the SS to blow him up along with the barracks, but as the alternative was a forced march to an unknown destination through the icy Polish winter. De Lanema chose to die lying down. He slept 4 days, then survived by sucking on sugar cubes foraged by another prisoner who had stayed behind. On January 27, he felt better, pulled himself to his feet, and walked out the door and through the gate of the camp. The first time he noticed were a number of furry brown dogs in the snow. He thought, gee, what nice little dogs. Then they started to move. The dogs were Russian soldiers in fur caps and white camouflage who had just liberated the camp. In Auschwitz, even the deliverance came in the guise of a celebrity. Also in Auschwitz at the time, a young Soviet colonel struggled to understand an apparition. Reverend Lieutenant General Vasily Petrenko, the only surviving commander among the 4 Red Army divisions that encircled and liberated the camp, was a hardened veteran of some of the worst fighting in the world. I have seen many people killed. Perecki says, I have seen hanged people and burned people, but I still was unprepared for Auschwitz. What astonished him especially were the children, some mere infants who had left behind in the hasty excavation. They were the survivors of the medical experiments perpetrated by the Auschwitz camp doctor Joseph Mendel, or the children of Polish political prisoners rounded up after the ill-fated revolt in Warsaw the previous fall. But Pritchard didn't yet know that. I thought, we're in a war. We've been fighting for 4 years. Million-strong armies are battling on both sides, and suddenly you have children. How did they find themselves there? I just couldn't digest it. Only later did Petre realize that this was a place where children was brought to be killed. By the hundreds of thousands they had vanished in thin air, and putrid troops marched by the ashes of their bones. Caught up in the Great War, the world took no special note of the event. The big news in New York Times that day was that the Soviet troops had swept to the Baltic, buried in the long list of towns overrun by the Red Army, as Auschwitz, a Polish name for Auschwitz. The place was by then a virtual ghost town, only with ghost population the size of Philadelphia. On the approximate 1.5 million who had passed through it, most of whom left behind only their hair and the smell of their burning bodies, just 65,000 were still left there in January 1945. As the Russian advanced from the east, the Nazi retreated to Germany, bringing their prisoners to kill among the way. Only about 7,000 stayed behind to be liberated by the Russians, many of them near death. And liberation did not put an end to their dying. Albert Grinholz, a French Jew, remembers Mongol soldiers of the Red Army riding into camp on horseback. They were very nice, he said. They killed a pig, cut it in pieces without cleaning it, and put it in a large military pot with potatoes and cabbage. Then they cooked it and offered it to the sick. The effects of that meal on people on the edge of starvation were nearly as lethal as anything the Nazi did. For that matter, Auschwitz is still claiming victory, as some survivors realize that the pain of their memories does not diminish with age. The Italian writer Primo Levi, author A Survivor in Auschwitz, threw himself down a stairway in 1987. Anyone who had been through tortured remains tortured, wrote the Austrian Jewish philosopher Jean Amory, who took his own life 33 years later after the Nazis failed to take it from him. Better never to be born at all, perhaps, than to live through Auschwitz. Of course, the Carginians probably felt that way too. Each generation marched into history, dripping the blood of its respective massacres. but Auschwitz and the Holocaust, of which is a part, have a unique place in the annals of the human slaughters. When Radana beat their neighbors to death in clubs, we take it as a dismaying evidence that human nature will never change. But Auschwitz was something new on the earth. It elaborate mechanisms for transporting, selecting, murdering, and incinerating thousands of people a day constituted a kind of industrialization of death. It raised the terrifying possibility that with the advent of modern technology, human nature really has changed. No wonder General Petroko had been uneasy for 50 years. At Auschwitz that day, the 20th century saw itself in the mirror and turned away in horror. Auschwitz was the largest of several Nazi extermination camps, and there is no reason to think it was a worse. It owes its prominence to its size and its special role as a death camp for Jews and Gypsies. Technically, the gas chambers were located in neighboring Birkenau and the headquarters of the network of slave labor camps housing Jews, Polish political prisoners, POWs, homosexuals, and common criminals. Among the newcomers were routinely told that the only way out of Auschwitz was through the chimney. That was never quite true. Along with more than 1 million who died there, tens of thousands lived there, worked, schemed endlessly and obsessively to stay alive, and even fell in love. Those who succeeded brought with them memories of how men and women lived in the shadow, the smell and dust of death. Their stories, some never been told, covering the period from the last great killing spree that began in the spring of 1944 to the death marches that following winter that has been collected by Newsweek correspondents on 3 continents for this, the 50th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz. In the spring of 1944, as the war increasingly turned against the Germans, trains bearing the first of hungry Jews began arriving in Birkenau. Until then, hungry 800,000 Jews, although oppressed, have been spared the worst of the Nazi terror, and it is likely that none of them bad even heard of the word Auschwitz. Of one of those trains rode 17-year-old Rita, her older sister Bertha, and Bertha's 2 children. 80 people stood together in boxcars for 4 swallowing days and nights. There was a bucket to drink from and another that served as a toilet. At one stop, Lambert got off to refill the water bucket and almost missed getting back on. As the train to Auschwitz began to pull away, she ran after it so she wouldn't be forgotten. Her train arrived at Auschwitz late at night and parked there until dawn, when the doors were flung open and the dazed passengers formed into lines for a selection. 5 by 5, they marched past Mengele himself, as beautiful as a statue. She remembers in his glittering boots and crisp black SS uniform. Old people, sick people, young children and their mothers went to the left and potential workers went to the right. She remembers her sister saw that mothers with children were going off together, but of course she had no idea why. So she put a scarf over my head so I would look older, and I took the hand of her son as if I was a mother. She remembers, we all went left. We were happy because we were together. Then I felt a hand on my shoulder. It was Mengele. How old are you? He said. In that second, I was hypnotized. I had a boy by the hand. I told the truth. He shoved the boy away. He fell down, and I was thrown to the right. And that's how I didn't go to the burning place, Sectarium. Other families are more successful at staying together. Gloria Lyon, who was 14 when she was rounded up by her family in Eastern Czechoslovakia, recalls how her 12-year-old sister Anna was sent off with the old people and children, but managed to sneak back into the other line and rejoin the family. My mother was very angry that she did this, Lyon said, because we conjectured that the old people will take care of the children and our group would have to do the hard work. Never was disobedience in a child better rewarded. Both sisters survived the war and still are alive. Sometimes the inmates who met the trains and escorted the victims to the gas chambers would, at the rest of their own lives, whisper to young mothers to give their babies to older relatives. Not many obeyed, of course. Helen, arriving at Auschwitz as part of an extended family from Transylvania, recalled that my sister Ethel said, "He's crazy. What do you mean I should give my child to an older person?" But in the confusion, the baby began to cry, and her mother-in-law took charge of him and disappeared off to the left. Guards beat Ethel back when she tried to join them. The sisters, selected for work, were stripped and shaved to the skin. We started to look for each other, shouted each other's name, Helen says. We couldn't recognize each other naked and without hair. When we found each other, we started laughing. We laughed so hysterically it turned into crying. So the transports arrived with their cargoes of innocent flesh from anywhere the SS could lay their hands on. Jews, France, a Jew, France, Holland, Slovakia, Greece, and of course Hungary, until the government halted the deportations in mid-July, after 438,000 Jews had been shipped to Auschwitz in little more than 2 months. The victims unsuspectedly walked to the gas chambers under the blank and baseball gaze of the SS, and then were turned into smoke that blackened the skies, and a stench so bad and pervasive that Lyon lost her sense of smell for nearly 5 decades after. Those selected for work was shown, tattooed with a number on their left forearm, issued uniforms, a bowl, spoons, and turned out into the barracks. Hundreds slept in triple-tiered rows of bunks. The newcomers faced the scorn of the Polish and Czech Jews who had come earlier. They told us, "While you were going to theaters, we were already here," recalls Judy, somebody who had brought to Auschwitz from a town in Hungary in May. The religious ones would pray. The other old-timers taunted them. "Go ahead, pray, but do you know where your mother is? Right up in that chimney." The new inmates entered a life of roll calls, beatings, and work, punctuated by surprise selections for the gas chambers, which Nazis kept busy even if no trains arrived. The roll calls were held twice a day, always open, and prisoners stood at attention until the count was complete, which might take several hours. This was hard enough for prisoners who weren't suffering from camp diarrhea. Standing became even harder, naturally, as Polish harsh winters set in. Cabos, the prisoner trustees, many of them criminals, whom inmates feared almost as much as the SS, roamed the ranks. They were to anyone who stepped out of place or stamped his frozen feet or whom they felt like hitting. By a whim of commandant, an orchestra of inmates were commissioned to serenade the prisoners as they marched off to the factories, mines, and construction sites. This was the unreal thing, this beautiful music, said Rachel, who came to Auschwitz in 1944 from a labor camp in central Poland. We marched out, the music accompanied us. We marched back, the music welcomed us. This is why it seemed already like life after death. The orchestra also played for the deportees on their way to gas chambers, and one inmate remembered the elderly Hungarian men tipping their hats appreciatively as they marched by. An inmate rations were a say coffee in the morning, a pint or so of watery soup for lunch, and a half-pound or so of bread for dinner. A person doing heavy labor outdoors obviously could survive this diet for no more than a few weeks or months, so those who lived, by definition, had some means of obtaining extra food, a skill the SS valued, a job where they could steal, or a protector somewhere in the camp. A large number of the survivors worked in the unit where the belongings of new arrivals were mysteriously sorted, tagged, logged, stored, and immediately stolen. The warehouse was known as Canada, after that fable land where everyone had warm socks and cigarettes. In August, Sigi, a German Jew, had been to Auschwitz since 1942, landed some of the most sought-after positions in camp, organizing the Canadian warehouse. One whole room was for storing toilet paper, a huge room, 12 or 15 feet high, full of toilet paper. It just stayed there, and nobody knew why. He had labeled each row and stacked them in order as the Germans wanted, and then filled the insides of the tubes with rings, watches, and other small valuables he could barter for food. Another job, which provided enough to eat, was Sonderkommando, the Jewish prisoners who met the trains, escorted the condemned to the gas chambers, and then hauled their bodies to the crematoriums. When they got off the trains, they had to strip in dressing rooms, said Henry, who worked as a Sandu Commando in the fall of 1944. Whole families went in, supposedly to take showers. When the chambers was more than half filled, they realized something was wrong. There was commotion. The SS beat them brutally with sticks. The Sandu Comos was hard physical work, made worse by the burden of never knowing when a relative might turn up in the gas chambers. Mandelbaum tells of the one legendary person whose volunteer walked into the gas chambers with his own family, and another who accounted his mother and assured her until the last minute that she was only being taken to the showers. For that sin, the Sandu Mando, own colleague was said to have killed him themselves. Some people screamed in the gas chambers, at least one group sang to Czech's national anthem, and some prayed. So this guy, one of the prisoner guards, escorted a venerable rabbi to the gas chambers and warned the naked old man that he was going to die. I told him he should say a prayer. Put something on, meaning a hat. Jews pray with their heads covered, so you can say a prayer before you die. I had a chance now to talk to someone about what was going on in there. Children, parents who never did anything in their lives, why should such a thing happen? He said, quiet, it is forbidden to complain. This is the will of God. You cannot answer these questions. He told me, tell the world what these evil people are doing to the Jews. But Rosenbaum answered, Rabbi, today it's you, tomorrow me. All the Sonderkommandos expected to wind up in the crematorium themselves eventually. It was part of the job. The Nazis assured their silence by purely killing them and starting fresh with a new batch. One Jew who escaped the gas chambers that summer was Roman, who was 15 and an orphan when he arrived in Birkenau from a small labor camp elsewhere in Poland. He talked his way into a job by volunteering as a specialist in running a lathe, a machine he had never laid eyes on. Survivor had a cost. Lying in his bunk one night, he was raped by another prisoner, an older man who had access to food. He put his hand with a piece of bread into my mouth. I badly wanted this bread. I wanted to swallow the bread quickly before he finished, so he would have to give me another piece of bread. I got a second and a third. He went off. In a moment, I realized that I didn't have my prisoner's cap. Any prisoner at the morning roll call without his cap was shot. He wanted to liquidate me, and so he stole my cap. That night, I stole a cap from some other prisoners, so the next morning some other prisoner was killed instead of me. I never looked to see who it was. One more prisoner killed. Who was to notice? Lives were saved and lost all the time that summer. Max, a Jew from Amsterdam, was saved by appendix. After 4 days of severe stomach pains, he was sent to the camp hospital, which often would have been a ticket to the crematorium. But the SS surgeon had never seen a case of acute appendicitis and decided to open up Garcia for the experiment. Saul de Limia was saved by a cabal who had smashed his eyeglasses out of spite. Shortly after, he went through a selection and saw healthy men sent to the gas chambers. He asked another prisoner why and was told they were wearing glasses. But the great news at Auschwitz that summer was the escape of Mela and Edward, the most famous of hundreds of Auschwitz escapees, because even in failing, it gave courage to thousands of inmates who knew about it and witnessed its legendary end. Sabebam, who was barely 20 in 1944, was one of the most extraordinary prisoners to pass through Auschwitz. Fluent in several languages, she was put to work as a messenger and interpreter. She apparently made full use of her position to carry out assignments for the camp residents, even managing to replace the ID cards of women selected to be gassed with those of women who had already died. She fell in love with Edward, a Polish political prisoner, and they resolved to escape. They succeeded in bribing an SS man to supply them a uniform, and she flinched a pass from the guard room. On June 24th, Garcia marched out this Edward, marched out of the gate of Auschwitz with a female prisoner in tow. But Auschwitz did not give up its victims so easily. They were caught 2 weeks later, still in southern Poland, and brought back to the camp for execution. The hangings were scheduled for September 15th. He went first. He slipped the noose around his head and, by an account, kicked over the stool that served as his scaffolding, shouting, "Long live Poland!" He was stood in front of the assembled woman prisoners who were subject to a lecture on the consequences of trying to escape. But before the guards could hang her, she pulled out a razor blade and slit her wrists, spraying the executioners with her blood. But even while the camp was awaiting the fate of two lovers, something else happened to give them hope. On August 20th, more than 120 Flying Fortress bombers from the American Air Base in Flaga, Italy, flew over Auschwitz en route to bomb the factories of Upper Silesia. One of the targets was, in fact, a satellite camp of Auschwitz itself, the giant IG Farben plant, known as Buma, that converted coal to synthetic fuel. We heard the sirens in camp, but there was no cover, says Mac Sands, who works in the warehouse at Buma. We stayed in the barracks, and when I looked out, the sky was covered. In his next shift, 2 days later, the damage made such impressions on him that he swears he saw locomotives on roofs. The downside of this was that he and his brother lost their soft warehouse jobs and were put to work hauling bags of cement on a repair crew, but it was worth it to see the Germans bombed. But no bombs ever fell in Auschwitz itself, nor in Buchenwald. American Jewish leaders, by this time well aware of nor on Buchenwald, that was that other camp. American Jewish leaders, by this time well aware of Auschwitz, pleaded with Washington to bomb the crematories. Hundreds of inmates might have died in such an air raid, of course, but it might have saved more than thousands of new victims who arrived every day. For that matter, the prisoners in the camps were hoping for the same thing. Our greatest anticipation was when the air raids were on, recalls Celia, 66, who was brought to Auschwitz from Hungary in May. It would have been our pleasure to be bombed. It never occurred to us to be afraid. But the War Department, contravailing even President Roosevelt wishes, seemed to have struck to a policy of not mixing military and humanitarian objectives. The best way to help these people, Assistant Secretary of War John McCloy insisted, was to win the war as quickly as possible. Even so, the bombing raids and the new filtering back to the prisoners in the fall of 1944 made it clear that the war had turned decisively against the Germans. For the Söderkomor, remember, they were the people that helped them to get off the trains and stuff, who never expected to survive the war. This was called to action. They enlisted the help of prisoners who worked in municipal gun plants, most of them women, to smuggle out gunpowder a few grams at a time. A plan took shape to blow up the gas chambers, attack the guards, and break through the electric fence that surrounded Auschwitz and Birkenau. But before they could, on October 7th, the SS demanded 300 of them for transfer, barely in museum, and the victim decided to die fighting. Unplanned and unorganized and vastly outnumbered, the rebellion had no chance. The Sonderkommando fought the well-armed SS troops with knives, chains, stones, and perhaps homemade grenades. One part of it worked. Bales of human hair, destined for German carpet factories, had been slashed in the attic of crematoriums. The Sonderkommando sprinkled them with gasoline and ignited them, setting ablaze the roof of the whole vast structure. 3 SS men were killed, but no one escaped, and the 663 members of what became known as the last Sonderkommando, 450 of them, one was shot by the SS and tossed in the ovens by the end of the day. And of the 4 women who helped him, Rosa, Roberta, Esther, and Alva, the 4 women were Rosa, Esther, Alla and Regina, were arrested and taken to the infamous prisoner block 11, where they were tortured for weeks, although without revealing their names of any of the conspiracies. In a letter smuggled out to her sister, Anna, Esther wrote about how familiar the sounds of the camps, the screams of the capos, the screams for tea, soup, bread, and all those hated sounds now seem so precious to me and so soon to be lost. Not for me, the glad tidings of forthcoming salvation. Everything is lost, and so I want to live. Esther was 20. On January 6, 1945, less than 2 weeks before the Germans abandoned Auschwitz altogether, the 4 women were taken to the gallows. Their fellow prisoners had been assembled for the spectacle. 2 women grabbed Anna and pushed her into the barracks to keep her from watching, but she heard the groans. It was the last public execution at Auschwitz. As fall turned to winter, the Red Army drew closer. New orders arrived from Berlin. The transfers stopped coming. The crematories went cold. In fact, the whole vast operation went furiously into reverse as the Germans began dismantling the evidence of what was to have seen the crowning achievement of the Third Reich. Crews sent to clean out the chimneys had to scrape out deposits of human fat 18 inches thick. The prisoners greeted these developments with mixed emotions, happy to see the Nazis losing, but troubled by the general assumption that the Germans would slaughter them all first. The Soviet offensive of Upper Sicily began on January 12th, and the Germans quickly fell back. Red Army's guns boomed over the roll call on the evening of January 17. The next day, long columns of prisoners began marching out of camp, thousands at a time, past the famous with its mechanized surprise, Arbeit macht frei, meaning work makes one free. I think that's one of your questions. Leaving behind the remains of the chimney that was supposed to be the only exit. Most were in various stages of starvation. Many had only wooden shoes or rags to cover their feet as they trampled over the freezing mud. The German officials enforced one simple rule. Anyone who fell behind for any reason was shot dead on the spot. You were outside, without fences, but you were not free, said Siggy. If you thought the camp was bad, just wait until the death march. Siggy had usable shoes, but several days into the march, a shoelace broke, which could have cost him his life. Just then he spied a branch poking out of the snow. He worked it free and laced his shoe together in time to rejoin his march. An act of God, he said. In the confusion of these days, quite a few prisoners managed to escape. Louis, who had been in the concentration camp since 1941, was working in the coal mines of something when the Soviet approached. He declared his own emancipation a day earlier by refusing to go to work, which in normal times would have meant a bullet in his head. He was marched to another sub-camp where he ran off and hid in a coal pile. After several hours, he felt safe enough to stretch, and the coal began to move, and 20 other people stood up from their nearby piles. But freedom also had its perils also. Walking on the highway north toward Lodz, he and his fellow escapees encountered a group of Soviet soldiers. They asked for our watches. We told them we have no watches. We are from a concentration camp. Oh, they said, you are Jews. Nobody likes Jews. Germans don't like Jews. Poles don't like Jews. We don't like Jews. They chased us into the forest and lifted their rifles. He was saved by the timely arrival of some Russian officers, including one who was Jewish. Those who didn't escape or died on the death marches were eventually loaded onto open rail cars for the trip to the camps in Germany. Having come in sealed boxcars in the summer, they now traveled in the open in the winter. They were so emancipated and pitiful that civilians sometimes threw them bread and even clothing as they passed. The SS guards discouraged the practice by shooting at the civilians. The last few weeks and months, as the Reich collapsed around them, were some of the hardest the prisoners had to endure. Linda, internal near Ravensbrück in Germany, gives a calm account of her 33 months at Auschwitz and the death march along a road paved with corpses in the snow. But she breaks down in tears at the memory of a kettle full of soup that overturned as it was being served, leaving the starving women to lick the food from the snow. Freed eventually by the Russians, she set off with some friends to walk back to Slovakia, living off the land. They went into a German woman's house. The tables were set with dishes and napkins. There was a tureen of hot soup. The woman had seen nothing like it for 3 years. Anger and hunger waged war with them until one grabbed the tablecloth and sent everything crashing to the floor. They searched the house and found the woman hiding in 2 SS uniforms in a closet. They roughed her up and moved on. Meanwhile, the Russians, having done their part for history, had moved on themselves. The survivors stood and walked out as free men and women, and miraculously got on with their lives. They went back to being tailors or jewelers, doctors and writers. Some went to Palestine and fought another war. You couldn't pick them out of the crowd, not in Jerusalem, Toronto, or LA, unless you happened to spot the number graven on the forearms. They and the others who passed through Auschwitz left behind, according to subsequent Soviet accounting, more than 1 million suits, coats, and dresses, 7 tons of human hair, and incompatible heaps of shoes, eyeglasses, cooking utensils, and other goods, counting only what was found in only 6 of the 34 storerooms of Canada, the Germans having burnt the rest. They took with them the incredible memory of the moment when a tall man in a shiny boot condemning them to life, the moment in which Rita sees a young boy pulled roughly from her grip and shoved to the left. From afar, I saw the little boy. He was lost in the crowd, shouting for his mother. He was lost. I hope he found his mother, and they died together. Related articles. The lovers, Jerry and Mace, the pieces of a uniform over the 4 weeks in the summer of 1944, receiving them from another political prisoner who worked in the storage area. A Polish Catholic, had reached a decision to escape Auschwitz, while Sia, a Polish Jew with whom he had fallen in love. You are the only one in your family left, he told her. Maybe I can save you. She laughed, but Birgit told her he would come for her in an SS uniform. On July 21st, he put it on, his hands shaking. He marched to the laundry room. He told the SS woman in charge that he had come for her, who was beginning to totter. Fright would be natural in a prisoner summoned for interrogation, but she was worried that she might collapse, sinking to the whole plan. So she hurriedly told the SS woman, I have to go. Hail Hitler. To her he barked, get moving. She passed him on rubbery legs. They walked together. They walked toward Buddy, a farm where 300 prisoners worked, and as they neared the checkpoint, an SS guard strolled out. He pulled from his tunic a stolen pass and reported 1 guard and 1 prisoner returning to Buddy. But the guard unfolded the pass. He looked at both of them. There was a lawn pass. Danky, he said. The escapee hid in the grain fields for 10 days. Soon he hooked up with the resistance, he hid her with friends. When the war ended, each thought the other was dead. But in 1983, he was a widower from Brooklyn, New York, learned that she was alive. She wrote to him and in June flew to Iraq and Lon married and Bruce 62 and Lon married met him with 39 roses, one for every year since Auschwitz. Another, Renee and her twin sister Irene, remember the concentration camps as a bleak patchwork of smells and pain. The acid wooden bunks, the medical experiments they both bore without crying. The memories are nearly primitive because the Czech twins were not quite 6 when they arrived at Auschwitz in 1949 or 43. From the beginning, the Germans made special use of the twins, housing them in Czech family camps set up for propaganda purposes. In July 1944, the family camp in Berkla was liquidated. I didn't understand what was going on, except we were taking our mother away. She was screaming and we were screaming. The twins were separated, and Joseph Mendel, the doctor who did all these experiments, whom the children called as our doctor, stepped up for his experiments. Renee was the control while Irene underwent injections and surgeries. I knew even as a child that I didn't dare make a sound. Whatever was done to made me sick. Once the doctor gave her a piece of candy after cutting her open. The flash of normal life made me feel terrible. As the Russians drew closer, all the prisoners in Renee barracks were herded onto the truck. I knew I was on my way to die. Here comes Dr. Mandel in his green convertible. He stops the transport. Only he could kill the twins. Days later, Renee was marched out of Auschwitz with most of the prisoners, but Irene, too weak to walk, collapsed among the dead by her barracks. A Polish woman scooped her up and took her home. An American couple adopted Irene, and they searched for 2 years until they found the other twin, Renee, in Prague.